So I want to just give us a bit of background about why we're here and what we're talking about today, which is the work 16 millimeter earrings. And we are, as part of this grant from the Mellon Foundation, really digging into our collection, digging into works that we've made that are of a cross-disciplinary nature. Pioneers that we have collected, like yourself, who have been doing this work for a very long time. It's nothing new, but have the potential and have already influenced successive generations of artists working in this vein. And we really want to see how works that we have collected here could potentially shape the field in the way that the way museums collect can evolve. So this is an important piece for us because it does mark one of these earlier acquisitions that we made and we presented here, and that we worked very closely with you to envision as a piece that can be part of a museum collection, because it didn't start that way. And I think that's what we want to talk about a bit today, is sort of the evolution of 16 millimeter earrings. This is a work that was, it represents a number of firsts for you. It was made in 1966, and it was a solo performance about really the emotional and sexual awakening of a young woman. You were 24, 23 when you made the piece. Right? So you were very young, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But the work was first presented at Judson Church in New York, which is located in Greenwich Village and has a long history of supporting the visual and the performing arts. And Judson's receiving a lot of renewed attention at the moment with the big exhibition at MoMA and other conversations happening about its history. It was an early venue for happenings by artists such as Robert Rauschenberg and Jim Dine, Klaus Oldenburg, and it was also home to the Judson Theater, which included choreographers such as Tricia Brown and Lucinda Childs, Steve Paxton, David Gordon, and Yvonne Rainer. So this really, for you, marked the first time you had conceived of a piece as a multimedia environment, and so I want to talk about that. It contained sound, projected image, objects, and movement, all elements that are now central to your work at large. And we've talked a bit about how, you know, this piece, in a lot of ways, I mean, I see it as a kind of a microcosm for what your work has become. And you know, it's really gained so many more layers, but this is at the kernel of all of it. So I guess my first question to you really would be, can you talk a bit about the first time you performed it and how you went about putting the various pieces together? It's a very spare piece. Its simplicity is part of its, I think, gravitas. But how did the whole piece begin for you?
Well, I think I was always trying to find a form where I could weave together all these elements that I was interested in. And I think that I had worked my way up to it because the piece that I did before it was called The Beach, and that was, again, a solo piece dealing with a lot of different elements like visual posters, and there was also an object in it, this kind of mountain that was made out of wood. I mean, I was working my way into what would be 16 millimeter earrings, trying to find, is there a form that's like a visual, poetic performance form that could include all these perceptions? I was thinking of modes of perception, and that each mode of perception was a world. So, and I think I was quite influenced by the visual artists, the way that they worked with materials, because I came more from a music and movement and performing background. In that way, I think I was more sophisticated than some of the visual artists that didn't really work with time as an element. Time is part of what we work with, and rhythm, that's part of our vocabulary. But the way that the visual artists use plastic materials, the way that they used the plasticity of materials and an object as content, that really inspired me. So I started working. I think the first idea that I had was this idea of accumulating a sound structure. And I was working very much with live sound, and then taped sound, and then live image, and then film image, and how the scale and the sense of each of those two perceptions could be altered by adding another element. So that was, in a sense, was a media exploration. So, for example, the first image in the piece, I'm sitting on a chair with my back to the audience, and I'm playing guitar and I'm singing. And then after a few phrases, you hear that phrase coming on over the speakers, and it's a little bit distorted, and it becomes a little bit more distorted, and then it becomes a loop, and that becomes the first element of the sound environment. So that was also the first time that I thought of sound as an overall environment. It was the first time I really worked with my voice as a, what would I say, primary element. First time I really made a full sound score. I mean, 16 millimeter earrings was so much a first for me. It was the first time that I worked with film. And I was thinking in terms of film, about scale, about how on stage, if I wanted to get this sense of a face, I couldn't really get that. I mean, I could put a little frame around it, but you would never get that sense of the scale relationship. And so that also became something that was very primary.
Do you think of this piece as a portrait?
I don't think I thought of it in those terms at that time. I was thinking, in a way, I was thinking much more abstractly.
Yeah.
It's looking back when I see the piece that I think, this is a rite of passage for a young woman, but I don't think I was thinking about that at that time. I was really thinking about perception, layers of perception, tactility, texture, much more like a visual artist. I was really thinking about the whole stage as a kind of canvas and how I could enliven the entire space.
One of the things that really strikes me about the piece as a visual art installation is the fact that, given the time it was made, 1966, it does have this kind of incredible relationship to, say, minimalism, it responds in a way to what was going on at the time, but it is, the economy of means that you used in terms of the visual elements is really interesting. The textures, I think, that you talked about are quite distinct. There's, the wig, the paper, paper metal, there's the fan, the
net,
and you chose
Slippers
each of those
furry.
things so
Yes,
deliberately.
very carefully.
And I mean, maybe you can talk about sort of how you edited back those elements in a way to, the colors were very distinct, the streamers, the red wig,
Yes.
it was all very visually, tight,
Yes.
I guess is the way I would
Yes.
describe it. Can you speak a bit
Well,
about how
I
you
have to-
composed it as a visual experience?
Well, I have to say that in my mind, I think it's actually not that simple. I think it's incredibly complex. So it's a funny thing that you would say simple and minimal, because I think it's actually so layered and complex,
Right,
and
visually.
and in a way you could say it was a kind of, again, I wasn't thinking of it at that time, but I'm such a different generation than the Judson people. And I loved that work. I mean, it was magical in its own way and very beautiful. But I really feel like I was doing something almost, Hegelian, but again, I wasn't thinking of it that way, but it's a real, that kind of complexity of texture is almost the opposite to me than minimalism. So, and also the emotional range. So it's funny that you would say simple, because to me, if I look at it now, I think what I'm doing now is very simple in comparison to that, because it was so complex in terms of, well, for example, at that time, we didn't have multi-track tape recorders.
Right.
So I had 4 tape recorders going on at the same time. My cousin was a sound engineer, so he, as they accumulated, so it was an accumulated loop environment, and then at a certain point, the whole sound went down. You don't get that so much in the Robert Withers film. He really did his own interpretation. It was really a kind of looping, mesmerizing sound environment that became more and more complex, like almost a canon.
Right.
And then the whole sound went down to nothing, and you just had the slinky going like this that was capturing that loop feeling, and then it went into the green sleeves. So it was very worked out as far as sound is concerned. But in those days, as I said, my poor cousin was sitting there with the 4 tape recorders. I had friends that had the 4 projectors, because I wanted each of them to be in a different. I wanted the film image to be plastic. I don't mean like plastic as opposed to glass, but had plasticity, shaped, and as an element that had a different kind of scale and texture. So my poor friends were sitting with these, I guess it's 3 projectors. So it was very complicated.
Very complicated. I think what I meant is that you created what was this kind of beautiful straightforward container for all these
Yeah.
layers of meaning. Because you're right, there were incredible layers within the
Like technically, I guess.
technical
right?
layers, and then layers of emotion and layers of experience that were being built into that piece. So I think there's an incredible interweaving of all those elements. That,
Well, I think I was trying to make what would I say, a visual and sonic poem. And it was very important that it was unified. It wasn't, because in those days also, there were a lot of people that were throwing film on the screen. I mean, there were a lot of people that were thinking the medium is the message. So you'd have, people that were using film, but it was very arbitrary and not very satisfying. So I just really wanted to craft it so that there were these, as you said, layers of meaning, layers of emotion, and also visual, what I would call visual rhymes. I really thought of it as a poem with rhymes, but the rhymes were visual. So for example, you have, and you could say that it was built on motifs. So I dyed my hair red for the piece, and then you see at a certain point the crepe paper flames coming out of the table, so that almost was like hair. And then you see at the end the little doll room, which was almost like an effigy with red hair. And it was just these ways of accumulating layers of you could say correspondence, I guess.
right, echoes. Yeah.
Echoes.
Yeah.
Echoes, that's a beautiful way of saying
Yeah.
it.
So, did you have a sense at the time, you were a very young artist, about the ground you were breaking in terms of working across the disciplines in this way? Or did it just feel like the thing to do to express what you wanted to express?
I think it was, for me, life and death. I had urgency about my own identity as an artist. And of course I was aware of what other people were doing, but I knew at that point I just had to follow my own path. And that for me it was, why I say life and death is, I don't know if people are thinking in those terms these days, in their 20s, but for me that identity as an artist and my, finding my own sensibility and, really, really listening to my own voices and really trusting that sense of creativity, was very, very important to me. I mean, it was just...
You were putting a stake in the ground. This was
life and death for me.
Yeah.
So intense.
Yeah.
And that piece, I was living that piece 24 hours a day. I just had it all worked out. And also, I think what's interesting about 16mm earrings is that, in a way, my performing was the last thing that came in there. So that's also very, I always felt very good about my performing, but I really objectified myself in a certain level. I had it so worked out that I could almost walk into it, and it was, in that way, again, I feel like it's more a visual arts piece.
Yeah, yeah. Directing yourself.
Yeah, and also the idea that I think was picked up years later in performance art, and I don't mean this as a, this was not really a narcissistic piece on any level. It was, and I remember Jamaki Highwater in the interview that I did for the Walker, the catalog, said, you are the last person that you think about in terms of a piece, even if it's a solo. And it's so funny how people look at solos and they mistake that, well, if you're doing this piece, then it's autobiographical. I mean, that's the last thing that I think about. It's really more, I am also an element in this. But at the same time, I said, I can use my hair as an object, and then I can build on my hair as an object, and then that goes into the wig, and that goes into the paper. I can use my, my singing and my playing as, like anything in my life, I can put and use that as a material, but I'm still objectifying it. I'm not caught up in it. It's more that I put that on the table, and that's a possible element in a piece. And I think then later on, when the performance art as a field came out, a lot of people were working in that way.
I think there is a lot of universality there is in your work, a lot of that, and this piece, even, I would agree, it brings that out. It feels less personal and more universal in certain ways. I mean, it's that abstract enough in the way that it's that the various pieces come together that it does, I think, give that sense of it could be any of us, so
Right.
I think that's part of the work's power as a
Yeah.
standalone.
And also, I remember that I'd never read Jung by that point, but I remember somebody saying, well, that last image of coming out of the trunk, in the fire was like a phoenix. And I said, what's a phoenix? And so then I started reading Man and the Symbols, and then I realized I should read this, but I have to also put it away because it, could get in the way. Like, this is a symbol for this. The symbols weren't symbols for anything. They were symbols for themselves. So it was very emblematic in that way. And I was also really thinking about emotion in that way, like human emotion. What is that exactly?
Right. There's a purity to it that is really incredible.
So it was, really, really, I'm so blessed that came into my life at that time.
So tell us a bit about how the work then evolved into the film, the Robert Withers film, and what was the process of sort of making that transition? The work already incorporated film,
Yes.
so how did you think about that next step?
Well, he came to me and said, I would love to document a piece of yours. And then the first thing that came to me was 16 millimeter earrings. So in a certain way, his film is an interpretation. I didn't really have so much control over it. There was a certain point where his editor had made it so one-on-one that I said, you have to change this. Because, for example, the section where I'm doing the movement and the Wilhelm Reich text comes on, it was a very ironic and kind of, very, very, what would I say, disjunctive relationship between what I was saying and what I was doing in the piece. And then from there, also those body images, those charts came on. Well, I guess she just didn't understand that. So she would edit it almost like I was illustrating what I was doing with the words. And I said, you can't do this. And at that time, I was having I have to admit, I was having a sort of depressed, hard period. And I would have pushed more now, but I did get them to push it over a little bit so that it had a little bit of that irony. And in some ways, I feel like my piece was a bit more sophisticated than the film is. Again, with the track, there was never that thing of the silence where you hear the paper. It was always this cumulative loops of material. But I think Bob, who I have a tremendous respect for, so I'm not putting him down on any level, but I think he was worried about that in terms of film, that it just wouldn't, that
nuance.
repetition, you wouldn't get the nuance. And so his structure that he has in the film is much more fragmented than mine was. Mine was really mesmerizing. It just kept on going until the sound came out, and then the slinky took up that, again, kind of mesmerizing movement. So it had more of a continuity.
And a connection to an audience.
So at that time, as I said, my energy was not at tip-top mode, and I just had to trust him. And also, he was making this film.
Yeah.
But I feel like I really have respect for him, and I feel that you really can get an idea of the essence of the film from my piece from it. Yeah. Even with the this, and that. So you get what this piece is from seeing that film.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I think it did, that film helped to, I would say, maybe frame the thinking around what this could be as an installation in a gallery space, because he already had to think through some of those storyboard type ideas, or the ideas of how the various components might come together in space in the frame of the camera.
Exactly.
And as we were working on Art Performs Life in 1998, I mean, you had done a vignette version of this piece had you done something with it in the library exhibition before Art Performs Life?
Actually, I don't think I had
just
much
the
of
wig,
that.
right? I think
just
some
the wig,
of the
because
props
what I did
had
in the
been
library was I had this kind of mountain that was based on a handmade mountain from Vessel.
Okay.
That was really fun because it was called Archaeology of an Artist. So what I did was I cross-referenced everything. So I took every red object that I'd used in every piece in my entire life and put that on the mountain. And then I took every silver object. And so it became almost horizontal cross-referencing of all the work over the years. So that was a slightly different concept, but it was fun, so much fun to work with it that way.
You synthesized.
Yeah, it was just a little bit like if you look at somebody's life rather than looking at it in a vertical way, it's a cross cut. All the red, all the black objects, and then you integrate those and you see how that works as a kind of theme of a person's life.
The notion behind that exhibition was that we wanted to really dig into the cross-disciplinary work of 3 artists who had had already, at that point, a very meaningful history with the walker. And you had performed at that point a number of times on our stage, and it really, for us, felt like the kind of work you were making and that Merce had been making for years as well, and that Bill was starting to work on, really represented a direction in art making that was leading the way, you know, and it was the future, and so for us it was an important exhibition to really show that history within each of your practices, but also how the 3 of you might have relationship to one another and resonance for other generations of artists. And so what we ended up doing with that exhibition, which I thought was such an important and exciting and challenging exercise, was to look back at the major pieces in your career and to synthesize those into really what were vignettes. Mm-hmm. They were, and you've called some of these shrines as well, but really kind of encapsulations of much larger, more layered, dense pieces that are very experiential for an audience and obviously for the performer. But that exercise of distilling them into something that could be experienced in a gallery, not just visually, but with sound, with your body as a visitor, experiencing the scale of some of these things. That can you talk a bit about how that worked with 16mm earrings and how that experience of kind of bringing it into a space felt for you?
Well, could I talk about the whole exhibit
a
little
little
bit?
Of course.
Because it was, the exhibit was a real breakthrough in my life. And actually, right now, I'm working on a new piece that was inspired by this exhibit. So the resonance has carried on, some of the experience of that. Because what I loved about working on that exhibit is that, yes, it had these elements where separate pieces, where you could really experience separate pieces in a very intensified and compressed kind of way. So that was part of the experience, but then there was some of that carryover from Archaeology of an Artist, where you had across the board, like the shoe timeline of all the shoes that I had used over the years, or we had a relic wall of objects. And I have to say that my way of working was different than both Bill and Merce, because Bill and Merce always collaborated with visual artists for the visual part of the work, where I made my own things. And then how do you deal with, this little mustache, or, it really was these relics or these little puppets. How would I make an artwork out of simpler objects, you could say, rather than an artist's made object? So that was my problem and challenge, and a pleasure. So the theme of my part of it was a kind of expedition, and you walked through a lot of different experiences. So the separate pieces were one element, and then there were overall kinds of experiences, like the dolmen, that they would be, I guess, what I would call more the shrines. So the dolmen music was in the middle of the space, and you could put the earphones on and listen to dolmen music and be sitting on the chairs that we sat on. There were shrines that were standalone shrines from Politics of Quiet and Volcano Songs. So that's what I liked about our exhibit, is that it had different, concepts of overall art pieces that were really made as art pieces, and then compressions of the pieces that were new entities. Mm-hmm. And then we had like a backpack, sort of a life backpack metaphor of the expedition, with slides coming down on the floor where you saw all the work, again, seeing the whole body of work. So thank you for letting me do it. And then there's one other element that I have to say, that this is what the inspiration for my new piece that I'm working on now. So what I did is, in each of the piece installations, I had a piece of music from that piece, and they all were in the key of A minor. So if you went into each of the installations, you actually heard that music, but you could also be in the middle of the space and hear that as one large music piece.
Oh, beautiful.
So that was, and I did something a little bit like that when we brought back Juice at the Guggenheim in 2009, which was a piece called Ascension Variations, where I took some of the early Juice material and put it with Songs of Ascension and had the people in the audience walking through. But there were musical elements from one of the pieces from Songs of Ascension. And so you could hear it very closely, or you could hear this overall, that the whole museum was resonating with with this composition. So right now I'm working on a very large, again, kind of installation performance work that I'm calling it Indra's Net. It's been commissioned by Mills College in their new big space. And it's going to be a combination of the audience walking through. There'll be members of the orchestra and my performers, where you could walk through and hear material, but then you hear the overall. Plus, I'm working with engineers from Dolby, and there'll be like a whole layer overhead, like almost a cloud of sound, and a layer underneath you. And then you can sit back on, I think we'll have chairs or something to sit on two sides, and then it would be more performative, and then move back more into this installation.
So the audience members just enveloped.
They're just enveloped, and that came very much from this thinking about this beautiful installation that we made.
Well, what I loved about the visitor experience was that they, as you mentioned, there was really this kind of palette of experiences one could choose from, and the installation was very open in terms visually, so you could actually kind of look around and choose these kind of pockets to go into and really kind of immerse yourself. And 16 millimeter earrings was kind of central to the show. I mean, there was a bit of an axis, I would say.
I think it was your first intense experience of the piece.
It was. You would
after
come
the
in,
Juice thing, which that was more the with our little log cabin, and that was more you were concentrating on site specific. So that was, and it did also have a little music to it.
Yes.
But 16 millimeter earrings, when you came around from this wall that we call the relic wall, that was your first piece that you really confronted. Or encountered, experienced.
Yes, I would say. But I remember it was one of the first things as we were planning the show that you wanted to resolve, because it was such a key piece. And it was because of the film that had been made. There already had probably been some of that process. Okay, we need this element. We need and we see them around the room. There's the table, but then there was the globe, which is also a projection screen. The wig, I'm looking at all of these things around the room, the dress. And so I think we had determined that certain elements needed to be visible as props in the space, but then there needed to be some kind of recreation without the physical performer there of the experience of that work as a live event. And maybe you could talk a bit about how you envisioned it without a body in it.
Well, again, I think I come back to the process, which was, thinking about paper, hair, net. I mean, I think I was thinking more, how do you get those layers of texture in a still piece, with no performer. But I think that my original thinking of the piece so much as an objective work made it actually pretty easy. So what are the rhyme elements? What are the motifs that I wanted to have in there? Well, the wig and the paper, for example. There you get I wanted to make sure that you got that sense of correspondence. So we had the wig, the paper, and the slinky, so those red objects. And I don't think of them so much as props as objects. Then you definitely wanted to have the film image of the fire, which was, I think that and Siri, you'd also helped so much. I mean, this was a collaboration, really. So then we wanted to have the image of the doll burning right behind the paper flame. And there you got, it was like kind of packed the two images, and again got the correspondence. Then the scale was very important. That was the only thing that was going to be hard without a body, because I was working so much with, I have to just go back a little bit, is that I started getting very interested in surrealism. And how I got interested in surrealism was that Art Forum had this whole, at that time, that fall, had an incredible issue of surrealism. And I remember reading it cover to cover. I think I was already thinking so much also about slightly dream imagery and
In
everything at
66,
that time
you're
in
saying?
'66.
That may have been the one with the cover by Ed Ruscha. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah,
I know
it was
I know exactly what
it was
that was.
so rich,
Yes,
and so
yeah.
I think that I was, really thinking about images of reality, but surreality, where you got the, where you saw the, the invisible, the ineffable magic that's going on all the time, and I mean certainly that's something that's in my work to this day. So but that was so inspiring to me, and it seemed to come right when I was already thinking about this. So part of that for me was this strange scale idea, that could you have, like a human being but the head was enlarged. And again, it's my process is so intuitive. I had this little chair in my house, my little tiny apartment that I was living in at that time, and I remember putting it over my head. And I remember just, seeing what that scale did, and then thinking about film as a much more three-dimensional plastic projection situation, three-dimensional sculptural. I keep saying the word plastic, and I don't mean
right.
plastique, or plastic as we would say in
mutable.
Something of plastic in terms of space. So
had you read Lewis Carroll as a child, or was there any?
I probably did, but I don't think that was coming up for me
No.
exactly.
No,
No,
it was interesting.
it was much more because I was using
questions.
film. And also, even in the first projection that you see of my face, the black and white projection, which is in the front of the table, again, everything connected. It was this, I think it was a revelation about how everything connects, interdependency, which, again, I'm still using. And that comes back to my biology class in high school. But when I realized all knowledge connects, that was like, how could that be? But I think it came from amoeba to human being. And I was just like, oh, that's the same, those are the same processes. And here we are at Cellular Songs, So I mean, here we are. But so I think that for the installation, I wanted to somehow give you that feeling of that scale, because that was extremely important. So I felt that you really got that because we hung it at the height of a person, the face.
And I think that the film with the magnifying glass plays with that in a very overt way that adds an incredible amount of that sort of surreal. I mean, I think I can see echoes of early surrealist films or Buñuel or something like that. There's something about that piece that adds that level.
Yes, it's very really dreamlike. The films are very dreamlike, and the first film that comes in black and white, which is the same sequence. Is it reversed? I can't remember actually. I'm sorry, but it's the same elements. But of course, it was a different take and a different variation. That's the one where the first time you see those, really see those eyes very close, and then I think it was also that particular image of the eyes through the lenses was the idea that the whole piece was seen through lenses. Again, that was like a layering thing, because of this thing of the film being another element in relation to the live performance. So that became, what would I say, the prototype of the thinking of the whole film, that you're looking through something to see something that you think has reality, but it has a different reality. So they're like microcosmic themes that turn into the macrocosmic overall.
Right. I definitely think this piece is a microcosm. I mean, I think that's why I think we're so thrilled to have it in the collection, because it's. I mean, it really. There's a lot to talk about within it, about your work at large, about the development of installation art at large.
Yeah,
and I agree with you that these are not props in the sense of. That you might think about relics from other performances or documentation of a performance, because you never thought of them as anything but art objects as you were making them. I mean, your thinking was as a visual artist at that time, even at that moment.
I mean, I made that little net dress myself with my own hand. I mean, very handmade art, but art.
That's right. And what I think is especially interesting about this piece is that to create an installation just felt like a very natural sort of way to pull the elements together, and that's that impulse of creating an installation was really, this wasn't just about documenting a performance. It
No,
was about,
absolutely not.
It was about, here's another way that this piece can be seen. There's the way it can be seen as a performance. It's been seen as a film, and now it can be seen as an installation. And so I think that kind of fluidity in your thinking was important to this piece, and to it being kind of a logical first piece for us to try to acquire in that way.
Yeah.
So that's one of my favorites.
Evolution.
Natural evolution. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we want to go through, but you've touched on the most key aspects of it. I mean, maybe just a bit more about this notion of the solo and how this piece kind of did it change your thinking about solos and what those could be in your future work?
Well, it was a 35-minute solo, which is pretty sustained, in terms of solo. I mean, I think my solo pieces had been maximum 12 minutes or something. So that was also a new way of thinking about form, that the duration was also very important. And so the next year in 1967, from that point on, I always did evening length works. It's unless I do a music concert where we have different songs from different periods. Usually from that point on, I started thinking in evening-long works. And also, I started even thinking about durational pieces, because the next piece I did after 16mm earrings, or major piece, was Blueprint. And that was a piece where the first part was in the Judson Gallery, then a week later you came, and the second part was in the big church, but using upstairs down, I kind of excavated the church. And then a month later, there was another part. So, so that was also the beginning of thinking about sustained forms. How do you break down these habitual patterns of the experience? Oh, you go at 8:30, you go and have coffee afterwards. Well, did you like it? Yes or no? But how do you make it that you actually break down that experience and make it that memory is also part of your experience, and that a piece could have a duration that lasts over a month or something like that. So it just was such a rich period of discovery at that point.
It was such a turning point for
it was a real turning point for me.
Yeah, and the way film really took off at that point. Well, I'm excited to see the film.
Thank you.
This weekend, it'll be.
And you've
really
seen
great.
the installation part of the piece. So for this piece, Cellular Songs, the installation. I mean, would you like me to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah.
So, Cellular Songs is a fairly abstract piece. It's very pure, and it doesn't really have characters. I mean, again, we could talk about the personas or characters in 16mm earrings. So that was another whole idea. We could talk about that. This is very fundamental and very, very pure, and very overlaid patterns and rotation, and this kind of sense of life being three-dimensional or four-dimensional. I mean, each person is very unique, but you're not seeing them from close up. And so I felt that one thing that I was missing was, how about the DNA aspect of cells in our beings, and our ancestral lines? The fact that each of us is so unique as an individual. And so my idea was, what about introducing each of the performers, and you're seeing them, in a way from the inside out, very intimately, because you're seeing MRIs of their bodies, you're seeing their faces very close, and you're seeing photographs of their family line going back as far as each person had. So that was this idea, like, again, getting closer to each human being, so that then when you go into the performance, you almost know these people. And yet, in a performance, you are seeing them from far away. And we're very much a group in the piece. It's very ensemble, and it's very much about the interdependency and the cooperation, I'm going to say, of women in this time of patriarchy as an alternative to competition and violence. So it was quite an undertaking to get each person to bring in their family photographs. Girls, bring in those photographs of your family.
Homework.
Homework.
Yeah.
But and then we have little excerpts from the pieces that we actually sing in the piece, so that again, in your ear, you're already introduced to two short excerpts from what you'll hear.
Again, the layering.
The layering.
Yeah.
And it is a real musical, it's like a musical video shrine. And these shrines seem to be a theme that have come up over the years. And what I try to do with the shrines is that they are usually meditative in one way or another. So, for example, Volcano Song's shrine, when I did that at PS 122, I had that downstairs, and you could sit in there. It was open an hour before you went into the show. And I felt by looking at that, you just calmed down a little bit, and you really got into the world of Volcano Songs. The Dolman Music is another shrine, and we did that at the Whitney Biennial, and people could come into that room from New York with all the, overwhelm of perceptual overwhelm coming in, and just sit and be with that music for an hour, and actually be part of it. And so that's sort of my idea of the shrines, is that it just is something that you can sit with and just ease out. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you're getting a much more intimate relationship to each of these performers. Something that I think is beautiful about the shrine is that it rotates. Again, this idea of rotation is something that's very strong in cellular songs, and I don't see 3 dimensions. And so this is very new for me, to have rotation as one of the major elements of a piece. And some of the music in the real piece, we're standing quite, it's pretty still, but the music actually becomes a kind of sound sculpture, because you actually can hear the way that it rotates, the form rotates. So with this one, you see each of our faces, and then they move over one, so that one person is not the center, of 5 of us. So each time our bloodline goes with us, but it's a slightly different...
But a shift in focus for the audience.
A shift in focus, and a shift of musical counterpoint, because our voices are also part of the installation, but even though it's the same piece, you hear it slightly different if the first person's voice is coming from here rather than from there.
Right. I'm very excited to see it.
So,
and hear it. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Meredith.
You're
this has
so
been
welcome.
so helpful.
Thank you. My pleasure.
For posterity, this will be an amazing way to, really have this piece.
Thank you so much. And I would like to just say how grateful I am to the Walker as one of the great institutions of the United States, of the world, and how, it's like we have a few what I would call enlightened institutions in the world, and you are one of them. And I feel like I've always been able to just be who I am here. And, for an artist, that, that kind of encouragement to just be very authentic to what we do is something that does not happen that often. And I feel that my use of different mediums and trying to weave these things together has always been understood and part of the vocabulary here. I've been never made to feel bad about, sometimes over the years, people just don't understand that you can be an artist and do all these different, work with these different elements, but actually you have to work twice as hard or 3 times as hard for each of these elements to be at the top quality and then weave them together. And there's a misunderstanding about that in terms of performing, because a visual artist can draw, paint, and sculpt, and that seems part of one whole. But for some reason, people think, no, you can't, be at top level as a composer, top level as a choreographer, top level as a director, top level as a visual artist, and then be doing good work. You're a dilettante or something like that. And I'm going, really, no. No. All of those have got to be kept up, and because our bodies are our instrument, even our technique has got to be kept up and everything, and so it takes that much more work.
Right.
Well, the Walker I've always felt totally understood, and it means a great deal to me.
Well, we are incredibly grateful for all the years of connection we've had with you.
Thank you.
Look forward to this new piece with great anticipation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good.